Good morning. I'm Chris Hubner, professor of philosophy and theology here at CMU, and it is my great pleasure to welcome you all here to the annual J.J. Thiessen Lectures, always a highlight of the year for some of us, and hopefully all of you. The J.J. Thiessen Lectures were founded in 1978 by Canadian Mennonite Bible College, one of CMU's predecessor schools. They are named in honor of a founder and longtime chairperson of the CMBC board. This lecture series seeks to bring to the CMU community and the wider public something of J.J. Thiessen's breadth of vision for the church. And I'm pleased to see, where did he go? Grandson of J.J. Thiessen, Gerald Wientz, standing in the back to help kind of embody the memory that we're celebrating here today. Our lecturer for this year is Dr. Kevin Hector. He is the Naomi Shenstone Donnelly Professor of Theology and of the Philosophy of Religions at the University of Chicago. Some call it the Winnipeg of the South. I first learned about the work of Kevin Hector as I learn about so many important things from my dear friend Peter Dula of Eastern Mennonite University. I distinctly recall receiving an email, and I was looking for it this morning, but Gmail, I think, erases things that go way back if you don't archive them. But I got an email from Peter out of the blue, as I often do, and he told me I needed to read a new book called Theology Without Metaphysics. Now, Peter isn't the sort of friend who simply offers suggestions or encouragement. He tells me that I must read or do certain things. And I'm happy to say that he is always right. To have a friend like Peter, someone who knows you better than you know yourself, and so has a robust sense of what you must do, is a gift that is unfortunately all too rare. I hope each of you can experience one such friend. So anyway, I did what Peter told me to do. And despite feeling a bit put off by the reactive tone of the book's title, I very much resonated with Hector's reflections on theology and language, and his suggestion that human speech about God is bound up with the dynamics of intersubjective recognition, or what we might call an exercise in mutual attunement. That's my summary, not his, so blame me if it's not exactly right. Hector's second book offers an important reading and a really fascinating, constructive reading of the project of theological modernism. Whereas it is often interpreted as an attempt to establish the epistemological conditions of a certain kind of theological knowledge, Hector proposes instead that theological modernism should be read in a much more practical manner, as a project that is animated by a concern for what he calls mindness. Mindness. Not mindness. Mindness. Here, faith is not first of all something to be elaborated over against threats of epistemological skepticism, which is how that project is often read. Rather, it is something to be lived and integrated into the full weave of our lives. Now, at the heart of both of these wonderful books is a concern that becomes more explicitly stated in his third and most recent book, namely an understanding of Christianity as a way of life, a set of practices, as he puts it, that is designed to transform one's way of perceiving and being in the world. What is most interesting about this book, among other things, is that it's couched as a systematic theology. Once again, something that is typically viewed as a kind of intellectual or theoretical project to which we then might go on and append a series of applications is reinterpreted as an eliminably practical exercise. In each of these works, Hector is touching on concerns that lie at the heart of my own philosophical and theological concerns. Because of this, I've often sensed, I haven't told him this, that he's kind of like a brother from another theological mother. Dr. Fodder is probably more technically correct. And so I am very much looking forward to these 2 days of further conversation and exploration together as he develops his conception of Christianity as a way of life, with a particular emphasis on the theme of sacredness. Please join me in welcoming Kevin Hector to deliver the 2025 J.J. Thiessen Lectures, A Sacred Way of Life, Theology as a Guide to Spirituality.
Thank you for that very generous introduction. And thank you for the invitation. Thank you to each of you for being here. I'm reminded again and again, especially the older I get, I'm reminded again and again of how much of my life is grace upon grace. God blesses me and then blesses those blessings and blesses those blessings. And a lot of that comes through other people. And so Peter Dula thinking well of me and passing on my unattractively named book to you, and you reading it and inviting me here, that too is grace upon grace. And so I'm filled with gratitude. Thank you. So then, it is not uncommon for someone to look at someone else's life and think, I want more of that in my life. Perhaps the person has especially close friendships, or they are especially witty or learned, or are especially good conversationalists, or have especially good taste. And we look at this aspect of their life and think, I want more of that. That is how I feel when I look at the lives of people like Simone Weil, Dorothy Day, Howard Thurman, Thomas Merton, Annie Dillard, Wendell Berry, and others. These people embody a spirituality that I find especially compelling. It's a spirituality that tunes them to the sacredness all around them, a spirituality that has taught them to notice more of this sacredness and to respond appropriately to it. I want more of that in my life. To get a quick idea of what I have in mind, consider the fact that some things are so valuable to us that we could not imagine putting a price on them. Their value to us transcends ordinary calculations of worth or exchange rate. No wonder, then, that we respond to such things with a sense of care and protectiveness. This is what it means if we say that an heirloom or a vow or life itself is sacred. We also experience a sense of sacredness in the face of transcendent beauty. When we are transfixed by the intricacies of a dew-lined spider web, or by the vastness of the night sky, or by the deep truth of a poem. Such experiences elicit in us a sense of wonder and contemplation. They are often accompanied too by a sense of surprise or being stopped in our tracks, precisely because these experiences stand apart from and thus seem to interrupt ordinary routine and perception. When people talk about experiencing sacredness in nature or art or architecture, this is the kind of sacredness they have in mind. Almost everyone has experiences like these, but some people treat them as a sort of clue about what really matters and about what is ultimately true of everything they encounter, and they thus try to experience more of life this way. They put themselves on the lookout for the sacredness of everything around them, accordingly, and try to treat more and more things as sacred. Just so, their lives are increasingly shaped by and oriented toward encounters with sacredness, much as someone else's life might be oriented toward achieving certain goals or pursuing certain interests. People who lead such lives thus cultivate a distinctive way of seeing things and of interacting with them. Their lives tend to be marked by patient attentiveness, for instance, rather than hurriedness, by an intense earnestness rather than cynicism or frivolity, by a focus on particularities and little things rather than abstractions, and by a resolute resistance to fads and consumerism and commodification, and in sum to anything that would make life more two-dimensional. I want to suggest that this way of seeing and this way of being is a kind of spirituality. As I use the term, spirituality refers to a person's sense of connection with transcendence, and a-spirituality refers to a set of practices designed to foster such connection. Our sense of the sacred is one of the key ways that we connect with and experience transcendence, and I will argue that it is a form of spirituality that is especially needful today, and by the same token, that figures like Thomas Merton and Annie Dillard are the saints that this age especially needs. My aim in these lectures, then, is to think more carefully about this sort of life and to identify some theological resources that could help us lead such a life. In the remainder of this lecture, accordingly, I want to say a bit more about why I think theology could help us lead this kind of life, and then in the second half, try to shed some light on what is central to this spirituality, namely sacredness. Supposing then that someone wanted to learn how to become more attuned to sacredness and thus lead a more sacred kind of life. If so, they might read the memoirs and biographies of people who have done so, or even better, spend time in the company of one of them. This is the obvious approach, and it plays an essential role in the way I think about these things. But I want to argue that theology can shed some light on this sort of life too. Thank you. Whoever said, To see why, think of a teacher who treasures the moment when things click for students. This teacher wants to get better at making these things happen, making these moments happen, so they start observing other teachers to see what they do to spark such moments. From these observations, the teacher may pick up a variety of tricks and strategies that they then try out for themselves and thereby add to their own repertoire of tricks and strategies. But that's not all they might do. They might also read a few good books on psychology and educational theory in order to develop a theoretical framework for thinking about what goes into making things click for students. Classroom environment, lesson planning, rapport with the teacher, and the like. These two approaches should work together. The theoretical framework helps them make sense of what they see when they observe good teachers, and what they observe in good teachers should help them discern what belongs in their framework. In the same way, if someone treasures glimpses of sacredness and wants to be more alert and responsive to them, and if they are thus drawn to people who exhibit such alertness and responsiveness, then it makes sense that they would observe such people to see what they can learn from them. But it would also make sense for them to hunt down some theoretical resources that help them understand what they are seeing in these people's lives and how these things fit together. Theology, I'm arguing, can provide such resources. First, it offers us a vision that helps us see more of the sacredness around us and how it all hangs together. I'll say more about this in a moment, but the idea here is that we have a big picture of what things are like. It can affect the way we see things, which things show up for us, for instance, and how they show up for us. One of my main arguments is that Christianity offers us just such a picture, and that this picture should make sacredness show up for us as sacredness. Naturally, the mere fact that we have a big picture does not guarantee that we will actually live in light of that picture. That brings us to a second resource that theology has to offer here, namely an account of the virtues we would need in order to be attuned to this vision of sacredness. Taken together, this vision of sacredness and of the virtues we would need to live in light of it add up to a way of life that can help us lead the sort of life I mentioned at the outset. When I say that theology can be a guide to spirituality accordingly, this is what I have in mind. With an eye to what follows, let me say a few words more about what each of these components amount to. beginning with the idea that a theological vision can shape the way we see things. To get a sense of what I have in mind here, consider a couple of examples. First, a few years ago, my family took part in a silly game, the rules of which were simple. The first person to spot a yellow car got to lightly punch somebody around them. Some of you have played this game. I see the knowing nods, yeah. We don't play this game anymore, not usually, but yellow cars still stand out to me. I cannot help but notice them. If not for the game, they would look like any other car to me, but the game made them significant to me. It put me on the lookout for them, and just so changed what I saw. This highlights an important feature of perception. At any given moment, there are literally countless things in our perceptual field. We cannot possibly notice or attend to them all, which means that most of these things will stay in the background, unnoticed and incognito. If I am on the lookout for something, however, then it is much more likely to stand out from the background as if it were lit up, trying to get my attention. Being on the lookout for something can thus change what shows up for us, and so what we see. Here's another example. When I was a high school teacher, I would sometimes accompany a friend to scout football and basketball teams that our school would soon be playing. My friend would sometimes ask me if I saw what route combinations a couple of receivers ran, for instance, or whether a team used a pin-down screen to set up their high pick and roll. I usually had no idea. But if I told him that, he would not so helpfully press me, saying, "All right, then just tell me what you did see." From his perspective, this prompt made perfect sense, since when he watches a game, he just sees things like route combinations and off-ball screens. He had a hard time realizing that when I watch a game, I mostly just see players running around trying to score more points than their opponent. He had learned to see things that I could not. My friend saw things differently than I did, just as someone playing the yellow car game sees things differently than those not playing. Hence, even if we were looking in the same direction, we would not see the same things in the same way. What we notice and how we make sense of these things are shaped by the concepts we bring to experience and by our sense of what things are significant. We usually do this so automatically that we don't notice we're doing it, but still, what we see and how we see is shaped by the norms and expectations that we bring to experience. Crucially, this means that we can learn to see things in new ways. This is why a chef can learn to perceive various flavors and textures that they otherwise would not, just as a musician can learn to perceive the sound of particular notes, and a baseball hitter can learn to perceive the spin of a particular pitch. Through practice, people can train themselves to perceive things that the rest of us might not. People can also learn to perceive a much wider range of things differently. Hence, if someone becomes a Buddhist, they might come to believe that all things are radically interdependent and impermanent. If so, they might try to train themselves to see things that way. For many Buddhists, this is one reason they practice meditation, precisely to loosen the grip of their old way of seeing things, their old attachment to that way of seeing, and to see things and themselves more interdependently. But they report it's hard to do. You have to learn to do it. By the same token, if someone became convinced that materialism is true, that is, that there's nothing other than that which falls within the bounds of physics, then this belief will surely impact the way they perceive things, in sharp contrast to someone who becomes convinced that all things are animated by spirits. In cases like these, a higher order belief about the way things are shapes the way someone perceives all sorts of things, not just a particular range of flavors and sounds, but a much, much wider range of things. That brings me back to one of my key arguments. Christianity has higher order beliefs about what things are like, about God, about human beings, and about all creation. And these beliefs can shape the way we see things. In what follows, I will argue that these beliefs can teach us, indeed compel us, to see the sacredness in all things and respond appropriately to it. When I say that a theological vision can teach us to perceive more of the sacredness around us accordingly, this is what I have in mind. Again, though, the mere fact that one holds such beliefs will not do the trick. The mere fact that a belief tells us that we should be on the lookout for certain things and perceive them in certain ways doesn't entail that we will actually do what the belief says. In addition to holding these beliefs, then, we also need to be trained to see things in light of them, especially insofar as we have already been trained to see things otherwise. Along with a theological vision, then, we need the formation, the habits, the dispositions, in short, the virtues that would teach us to live in light of that vision. With an eye to what follows, therefore, let me say a few words about the idea of virtue, as I understand it. Everyone fights about this. Here's how I understand it. Very broadly, a virtue is a quality or trait that makes something good at what it is for. A novel's virtues thus include interesting, well-developed characters and a plot whose unfolding is earned yet not entirely predictable, just as a bread knife's virtues might include its serrations, its shape, its sharpness, and so on. In many cases, moreover, certain traits will count as virtues simply because they make something good at being the kind of thing it is. If you think of breed standards for dogs that identify what would make a particular dog a good instance of its kind, those things, if they are in fact what makes a dog a good version of that kind, those would be virtues simply in virtue of their being the sort of thing that makes that dog a good version of the sort of thing it is. Needless to say, humans can be good at all sorts of things and can therefore have all sorts of virtues. Especially skillful musicians or athletes are thus called virtuosos, since they embody the very qualities or traits that make someone good at playing music or sports. People can also be good at being good to others, reliably good, that is, at doing the right thing in the right way at the right time and for the right reasons. People can likewise have qualities like toughness or resoluteness that help them handle misfortune without being crushed by it, qualities of curiosity and fair-mindedness that help them make sense of themselves and their circumstances, and the quality of practical wisdom that helps them know how to respond well to a wide range of life circumstances. These are all virtues, which is to say they are all traits that can help us lead good human lives. In addition to these, a person can also have traits that make them good at noticing sacredness and responding appropriately to it. Traits that attune them to sacredness. And I want to say that these are spiritual virtues, and the three I'll consider in this set of lectures are the so-called theological virtues of faith, love, and hope. If we put these pieces together, then, we would get a theological vision that calls us to see more of the sacredness around us, along with a set of corresponding virtues that train us to live in light of that vision. When I say that theology can serve as a guide to spirituality, again, this is what I have in mind. And in the lectures that follow, I'll spell this out in terms of a vision of God and the corresponding virtue of faith, of creation and the virtue of love, and of fulfillment and the virtue of hope, all of which work together to help us become more attuned to sacredness. Let us suppose then that theology can indeed serve as a guide to spirituality. The second and third lectures will put that supposition to the test. Before turning to theology, however, I need to say a bit more about the spirituality that it is meant to be a guide for. And so I turn to sacredness. To understand sacredness, I think it's helpful to consider three principal ways that sacredness tends to show up in people's lives. Three kinds of thing we tend to experience as sacred. Sacred value, which is the sort of sacredness something can have in virtue of its inviolable worth. Sacred beauty, which is the sacredness something can have in virtue of its captivating depths or intricacies or magnificence, and sacred power, which is the fearsome kind of sacredness we encounter in the presence of a transcendent power that holds our fate in its hands. My plan here is to talk about each of these in turn and then consider how and why we might try to hold them together. So we begin with the fact that some things are sacred to us because of their transcendent value or worth. These are things that we could not imagine putting a price on. Indeed, the very idea of putting a price on such things seems obscene, since their value sets them completely apart from ordinary calculations of exchange and monetary worth. To see what this looks like, consider a handful of examples, starting with the sacred worth of every human being. We have a handy word for this sort of sacred worth: dignity. Because they have such worth, we rightly feel that human beings cannot be subjected to ordinary calculations of price or exchange. This is why it would be a category error of the grossest kind even to ask how much someone would sell their child for, just as it is a category error of the vilest sort to think that one could buy and sell human beings as if they were chattel. Human beings must be set apart from these ways of measuring value precisely because each human has immeasurable worth. This sacred worth explains why we experience horror, or should experience horror, when someone is tortured, abused, raped, molested, or tormented. We are horrified precisely because such mistreatment is a desecration. It violates what should be inviolable, namely a person's dignity. Here, too, it would be a category error to include such violations in any sort of cost-benefit analysis, as if raping or torturing someone would be all right if it saved a certain number of lives. Our repulsion at this idea and our horror at this sort of treatment are an appropriate reaction to violations of sacred worth. Sacred worth thus elicits in us a sense of protectiveness. This is part of what it means to treat this sort of worth as sacred, to regard it as inviolable, and thus to regard violations of this worth as unthinkable, as unconscionable, as beyond the pale, and to treat them as such by protecting against them and creating taboos around them. The inherent dignity of each human being is thus a paradigmatic example of sacred worth. Each of us has this sort of worth simply in virtue of being human. But we can also confer sacred value on certain things by tying our dignity to them. So, if I were to make a sacred promise or a sacred vow or take a sacred oath, and if I then failed to keep my word, I would be violating my own dignity. It would be as if I were desecrating myself in so doing, since in giving you my word, I have bound my worth to doing whatever I said I would do. We can likewise tie our worth to a cause or a principle in such a way that, again, failing to live up to these principles would violate our dignity. We see this when a reporter would rather go to jail than give up their sources, or a scientist would rather lose their funding than massage a data point in support of a splashier finding, or a vegan would rather go hungry than eat an animal. People can thus make certain principles inviolable to them, which explains why they are utterly unwilling to compromise these principles. For to do so would be to profane something they regard as sacred, and in so doing violate their own worth. We have a handy word for this kind of sacred value too, though it is a bit old-fashioned. The word is honor. To be sure, honor sometimes refers to public esteem, as when we honor someone by giving them an award, but here I'm using it to refer to someone's standing in their own eyes. In their own eyes, that is to say, they would be diminished as persons. They would be tarnished if they failed to live up to the principles that they had bound themselves to, principles that they are honor-bound to uphold. This is the sense of honor we have in mind when we say things like, "On my honor, I pledge to do such and such," or when we ask someone accusingly, "Have you no honor?" Tellingly, the latter question is roughly equivalent to, have you no shame? And is nothing sacred to you? If there is no principle that someone would not compromise, no vow they would not break, if they seem finally incapable or unwilling to bind themselves to any sort of ideal, then we might rightly surmise that this person has no honor. This sort of sacred value also calls for protection. As mentioned, people often protect these values at great cost. Indeed, they would often rather die than compromise them, since their very worth as a self is bound up with them. To compromise them would be to desecrate these things and desecrate their very worth as a person in their own eyes. This is one reason why certain negotiations become impossible. For to treat certain things as if they were negotiable or subject to trade-offs would be to profane them in the eyes of people for whom they are sacred, which explains why attempted negotiations often serve to harden rather than soften people's positions. That brings us to a third example. In addition to the sacredness conferred by dignity and honor, things can also be sacred to us simply because they are so special to us, so irreplaceably, inestimably, pricelessly valuable to us. The time spent with a dying loved one can feel sacred in this sense, as can the memory of that person, as can the things one closely associates with them. Think here perhaps of a parent leaving their deceased child's room exactly as it was, since everything in that room has now been sanctified by its connection with that child. When something is precious to us in this sense, we care about it and we think it deserves all the care we can muster because it is sacred to us. As the preceding example suggests, relationships are a common source of such sacredness. When my relationship with a particular person is precious to me, it can sanctify things that signify that relationship or are an important part of it. A meal can thus become sacred to me, or a place, or a tradition. More generally, things can have this sort of sacredness insofar as they are especially significant to me. The shoes I wore when I learned to walk again might thus be sacred to me, for instance. By the same token, an original copy of the Declaration of Independence would have sacred significance for a lot of Americans, as would an original work of art or a drawing by a famous artist. But notice that significance here is always significance for particular persons, which is why an original Salvador Dali drawing would not be sacred to me. If I discovered one in a used book, I would sell it immediately. Whereas if I found one of my kids' childhood drawings, I wouldn't dream of selling it. Generally speaking, then, something can be so significant to me, so precious to me, that its value completely transcends ordinary calculations of price and worth. Such significance comes in degrees, however, which explains why there may be cases when someone would sell or trade something that is sacred to them, precisely when it would be for the sake of something even more significant to them. I could imagine someone selling an irreplaceably precious heirloom, for instance, in order to pay for life-saving medical treatment for one of their loved ones, but not in order to buy a cool pair of sneakers. In the former case, the heirloom could still count as sacred to them, but not in the latter. One more clarification. By contrast with dignity, preciousness depends upon something being special to us, which means it is not something that everything can have. These kinds of sacredness can thus pull in opposite directions, as when the preciousness of one's own children and the dignity of all children seem to pull in opposite directions, which is a source of some dilemmas to which we'll return in the third lecture. Briefly then, these are three paradigmatic examples of what I am calling sacred value, namely dignity, honor, and preciousness. In each of these cases, the worth of a person or a thing transcends ordinary calculations and trade-offs and demands a special measure of care and protection. This is one important kind of sacredness. That brings us to a second kind of sacredness, which is the sacredness we experience when we have a sense of the deeper reality or the something more of things around us. When we are wonderstruck by this deeper or bigger reality, and when we find such experiences captivating. These are experiences of what I would call transcendent beauty. Not all beauty is transcendent, of course. Some things are beautiful simply because they are pleasing to the eye or ear. They are easy on the eyes, as people once said. These are things that are pretty, like a straightforward painting of flowers or a catchy tune. We do not use the word beauty to characterize things that are similarly pleasing to the sense of taste or touch or smell, interestingly. We might use the word lovely instead to include all of these. But it seems clear that the pleasingness of a delicious meal or a soft fabric or fresh lavender are exact analogs, so I'll consider all of them under the heading of beauty. What makes these things beautiful is their pleasingness to the senses, a pleasingness that makes us want to linger on them and to savor them. There's something alluring about such pleasures, in other words. Transcendent beauty is like this in some ways. There is something pleasing about it, for instance, and something alluring. But what makes this beauty transcendent is that its pleasingness draws us into its depth, or into what I'm calling something more. And it is precisely this depth that captivates us, and that we experience as standing apart from ordinary perception, that we experience as a glimpse of the sacred. One version of this is when something shows up for us in its otherness, when we see its peculiar goodness as if for the first time. Think of things that stop us in our tracks. A deer crossing our path, or a goldfinch alighting on a nearby branch, or seeing a loved one all dressed up for once. There's a sense of unexpectedness in these encounters precisely because they do not fit into our expectations. They stand out from our taken-for-granted way of seeing things, and in so doing, it is as if they call to us from another dimension. Annie Dillard has a nice way of helping us think about what it's like to see something this way. She consulted medical interviews with people who had cataract surgery soon after its invention. Many of these people were very literally seeing things for the first time, and many of them found that overwhelming for good and for bad. But they gave Dillard a clue about what it would mean to perceive things apart from what we expect to see, and primed her to try to do so, to try to see things as if for the first time. And as it happens, as she notices, our ordinary ways of perceiving the world are fraught with all sorts of expectations and preconceptions. But things themselves, in their otherness, transcend these preconceptions. We catch glimpses of this here or there. We have moments when things arrest us in their otherness, and Dillard thinks this is a clue to the way all sorts of things transcend our expectations. And so she tries to put herself on the lookout for them. When something does arrest us in its otherness, it often elicits in us a sense of wonder and a sense of sacredness. We have a sense of being in the presence of something transcendent, something more, because the goodness of this thing shows up beyond the limits of our ordinary perception. And it makes us want to linger on this beauty and see more than just a glimpse of it. That's one kind of what I'm calling sacred beauty. We see another related kind when we perceive something as if it were a whole world unto itself. Not just any whole world, of course. There has to be something good about it. Otherwise, there has to be something pleasurable in contemplating it. Otherwise, there are bad worlds, presumably. That could be a whole world, but that's not a kind of sacred beauty. To get an idea of this, think of looking in someone's living room window at night, non-creepily, and seeing an entire life taking place there. My wife and I go for a lot of walks in the evening, and so this time of year it's dark earlier, and so our evening walks often involve walking past houses where the lights are on inside but it's dark outside, and you're not trying to be a voyeur of any sort. As you'd walk by, though, you can't help but look in and see, oh, there's just a whole world there. And it's a whole world quite apart from the whole world that I occupy. And this is an example of what I have in mind by a different kind of sacred beauty. The people and things I see there inhabit a world of their own, which means, among other things, that they are irreducible to their place in my own world. What is more, if I could look closely, I would see all sorts of goodness in their world. Things that bring them joy, relationships they care about, all the pleasures of this world, a world as richly textured and good and integrated as my own world. Or think about getting to know someone well enough to realize that they have their own encompassing perspective on the world, and that the way things show up for them is integrated into their projects, their ideas, their style, their dispositions, and so on. Their perspective on the world is just as expansive, just as integrated as one's own, which is to say that it transcends one's own perspective. Yet there is something fascinating about trying to inhabit someone else's perspective in this way, which is the reason why people love good novels with well-drawn characters and why people don't love novels with two-dimensional characters. They're missing the thing, one of the things that novels should bring us. We can and sometimes want to get lost in these other worlds, for in contemplating them, it can feel like they open us up to something more, to a plenitude or abundance or muchness in the world. It can thus feel like each of these worlds is a window onto other worlds and a clue to their existence, and can thus instill in us a sense of their transcendence and beauty, and just so a sense of sacredness. I might even say that they have a sacramental character. Here's one more example of transcendent beauty. Think of the sense of awe one sometimes feels when one beholds the night sky, or the moon rising against the horizon, or mountains, or a sea, or a field, or a forest. In cases like these, one has a sense of standing before vastness, of something immeasurably big, which makes one feel correspondingly small, but crucially not diminished or threatened. If one felt threatened, as when there's a storm looming on the horizon, one would have a very different sense. But when one is just in the presence of something that just feels immeasurably bigger, and one feels not diminished or threatened by that bigness, but just small and in place against this background, one tends to feel a sense of serenity, of peace, of stillness, a sense that one can just be in the presence of this. There's a sense of transcendence attendant upon such experiences, a sense of standing before something that stretches beyond my ability to perceive it, and of my own smallness in the face of it. This is a sense, once again, of a window onto something more, of something that exceeds the horizons of ordinary expectations. Such experiences can seem to invite one into a sacred realm. In all three of these cases, then, cases where we see the goodness of things as if for the first time, cases where we see other people and things as an entire world, and cases where we feel small but peaceful in the face of vastness, we experience a sense of wonder and mystery, a sense of catching a glimpse of transcendence. We want to linger in them, to see more of them, and perhaps try to hold on to them. These are experiences of what I'm calling sacred beauty. Almost everyone has experiences like these, experiences of transcendent beauty as well as transcendent value, and almost everyone experiences them as holding some sort of special meaning or intrinsic significance. It's hardly surprising then that some people would want to fashion a life out of such experiences, whether by directing their lives toward transcendent value or transcendent beauty, or by trying to combine the two, by treating one of them as more basic than the other. So think of an aesthete like Oscar Wilde, for instance, or contemporary activists who organize their entire lives around defending a cause. But there's another way of fashioning such a life. To see what this is, consider a third variety of sacredness, the sacredness of a transcendent power that holds one's fate in its hands, or in short, a god. We have a special word for this kind of sacredness, namely holiness. The sort of holiness that elicits terror-charged awe from those who stand before an unapproachable God, and that thus leads them to bring offerings and sacrifices that would please or appease this God. We have some nice portrayals of such holiness in movies. Think here of Te Ka, who turns out to be Te Fiti in Moana, or the angels who emerge from the Ark in Raiders of the Lost Ark, or the Wizard of Oz before his unmasking. We also have some striking descriptions of this kind of beauty. Listen to Flannery O'Connor's description of Mrs. Shortley's vision in her short story, The Displaced Person. Suddenly, while she watched, the sky folded back in two pieces like the curtain to a stage, and a gigantic figure stood facing her. It was the color of the sun in the early afternoon, white gold. It was of no definite shape, but there were fiery wheels with fierce dark eyes in them spinning rapidly all around it. She was not able to tell if the figure was going forward or backward because its magnificence was so great. She shut her eyes in order to look at it, but it turned blood red and the wheels turned white. Or here's Hildegard of Bingen. She's a medieval mystic. Here's her description of holiness. And she is so bright and glorious that you cannot look at her face or her garments for the splendor with which she shines. For she is terrible with the terror of the avenging lightning, and gentle with the goodness of the bright sun. And both the terror and the gentleness are incomprehensible to humans. The terror of divine brilliance in her face and the brightness of her beauty in her garments, as the sun cannot be looked at in its burning face or its beautiful clothing of rays. These examples help us see one important feature of holiness, namely its unapproachableness, its forbiddingness, along with a sense of terror that it elicits from those who encounter it, as if one were in the presence of a transcendent power that holds one's fate in its hands. This explains, in turn, why things connected with this power would be regarded as holy too. If something belongs to the leader of a local gang, I'll be careful not to mess with it, since messing with something that belongs to a gang leader is tantamount to messing with him. For that reason, I would probably steer clear of anything that belongs to him, or at least go out of my way to take good care of those things. In the same way, if I encounter a terrifying, transcendent power, an unapproachable power who holds my existence in its hands, I will want to make sure I do not do anything to anger that power, and will therefore show the utmost respect to things that belong to it, to its representatives, and even to the very name of this power. But that brings us back to a point mentioned earlier. Again, almost everyone has things that are irreplaceably valuable to them, just as everyone has been wonderstruck by unexpected beauty, which is to say that everyone experiences these kinds of sacredness. Far fewer people have had a first-hand encounter with the sort of transcendent power that I've been talking about. Interestingly, though, it is not unusual for these encounters to be passed along within social groups, such that many more people experience this sacredness at second hand. The mechanism here goes something like this. Someone has a terrifying encounter with the transcendent power that holds their fate in its hands. The person, visibly shaken by the encounter, tells others about it. Several people thus come to wonder what this fearsome power wants from them, and in particular, how they can avoid its wrath and secure its favor. They therefore seek ways of showing respect to this power, and once instituted, scrupulously adhere to these ways and insist that others do likewise. Customs and teachings regarding this transcendent power thus spread, and with them some sense of the sacredness involved in the original encounter. We could call these customs and teachings a religion, so long as we remember that not all religions work this way. That brings us to a key point. As these customs and teachings about a transcendent power are passed along, they often provide their practitioners with ways of integrating other forms of sacredness into their lives. There are at least two ways that this could happen, an indirect way and a direct one. First, it would not be surprising if sacred value and sacred beauty became involved in religious practices. For if holiness elicits a desire to bring God the best one has to offer, then one will offer God things of the highest worth, or at least a portion thereof. If so, then sacred value would be taken up into religious practices. And if God is regarded as occupying a transcendent realm, then it would not be surprising if at least some experiences of sacred beauty were thought to connect us to this realm or offer us a glimpse of it. This might explain why many religious practices are themselves beautiful. That's one way that sacred value and beauty could get taken up into religious practices and thus held together by them. Another way is more direct. Imagine a tradition that understands God as the source and goal of all goodness. It regards all goodness as due to God's own goodness, in other words, and therefore as reflecting God's goodness and finding its fulfillment in God's goodness. If so, then all valuing, including the sacred variety, would ultimately be a valuing of God, just as all beauty would ultimately bear witness to God's own beauty. In that case, orienting one's life toward transcendent power would simultaneously orient one toward transcendent value and beauty, and vice versa. Such a religion would thus teach people to gather up all three forms of sacredness and direct their lives toward it. In what follows, I will argue that Christianity is just such a religion. There is one, maybe more than one, there's at least one big problem facing this sort of approach. It's easy to see why someone would want to be attuned to things that truly matter. It's easy to see why they would want to be attuned to transcendent beauty. It is not so easy to see why someone would want to be attuned to sacred power, as I've described it, other than to avoid it as much as possible, since sacred power is forbidding and terrifying and the like. This is a serious problem, but its seriousness depends entirely on the character of this power. We'll spend much of the next lecture, accordingly, addressing precisely this question. What is this sacred power like? I've tried to cover a lot of ground in this first lecture, so let me leave you by recapping its two big points. First, I argued that theology can provide us with a vision that calls us to notice more of the sacredness around us and respond appropriately to it, along with an account of the virtues we would need in order to live in light of this vision. This is what I mean when I say that theology can be a guide to spirituality. And second, I considered three main varieties of sacredness: sacred value, sacred beauty, and sacred power, and suggested that in orienting us to transcendent power, a religious tradition might simultaneously orient us to transcendent value and beauty. In the second and third lectures, I will argue that this is just what we see in the Christian tradition, so I hope to see you back here tonight. Thank you. So we now have time for questions, and I believe the procedure is to come up to one of these microphones. I'd be delighted if when you did that you would introduce yourself, and then we can have a conversation.
Hi, I'm Carl Koop, and I teach history and theology here at CMU. I very much appreciate this lecture, and I'm very intrigued by the title, A Sacred Way of Life, Theology as a Guide to Spirituality. Now, in Christian theology, in the Eastern tradition, for example, worship, spirituality, prayer precedes belief, precedes theology. It is in the context of worship that one thinks about theology. Worship is prior to theological thinking. We might say that faith seeks understanding, or the law of prayer precedes the law of belief, lex orandi, lex credendi. Yep. And you seem to be suggesting somewhat the reverse. Theology leads to spirituality. It's not that spirituality precedes theology. I'm wondering if you could talk about the relationship, the dynamic between these two, and how you see it in light of Christian tradition, the way this relationship has been often perceived.
That's a great question. Thank you so much for that. If I made it sound as if I think that there's a kind of priority of theology to spirituality, that's not what I meant. So among other things, I'm glad for the chance to clarify that. I do tend to think of them as working hopefully more in a kind of circle than one coming before the other. And so in the example I gave of a teacher who's trying to figure out what makes things click, there's a kind of going back and forth between the practice and the reflection. The reflection informs the practice, helps one get better at that, see what's going on in that. But the practice itself is going to inform what kind of theory that one is appealing to. And my sense is that the sort of spirituality that I care about here should absolutely be informing the theology. It's not as if I started off by sort of just looking at theology and then decided like, yes, this will tell people how to be spiritual. It's more the sense that I attended to some people whose spirituality, I have just this deep sense that there's something right there, and that guided me into thinking about, well, what sort of theology would be congruent with that and might even support the kind of spirituality that I see there, and then try to see, does this help me come back to the spirituality that set me off on this in the first place, right? So there's a sense in which the spirituality is a guide to the theology that is supposed to be a guide to the spirituality, right? So there's much more of a kind of feedback loop. Yeah, thank you. That's a great question.
Hey there, thanks
Hi.
so much for being here. The name is John Bhupal and I teach in the Department of Biblical and Theological Studies. I appreciated a lot of things that you said. At the beginning you said there are things that help us notice this sacredness, right? And then you kind of hinted that there might be a difference between clues that help us to notice the sacred over against fads. So I'm wondering if you can just help unpack the kind of categorical difference between clues and fads. What is that difference?
Clues and facts?
Fads, F-A-D.
Oh, fads.
Yeah. Your word.
Yes. Right. Using my words against me, I see. So I had a sense in working through this that every time I tried to put words to it, I felt like I was stretching. And I really like precision, nailing things down. I'm overly fond of saying, when I use this word, I will mean thus and such and not these other nearby things and so forth, right? I have much more patience for that than many of my family members. But my sense is that there are times when we notice something, and in noticing this particular thing, we have a sense that, oh, this isn't the only thing that's like that, right? So here's one example. There are people in my life who I have found, let's just say, difficult. And then I have discovered something that has gone on in their lives that have contributed to them being that way, right? I have much more of a sense that they are not nothing but this difficult person I'm encountering. They are a three-dimensional person, and knowing that they've had certain experiences that explain why they are the way they are, helps me understand them, but it also helps me think, oh, I bet that's true about a lot of other people too. And so when I talk about a clue, that's the kind of thing I mean, right? You take it that it's a pointer to some bigger kind of truth. My thought about fads, I'll talk about this more tonight, but there's something interesting about the list of figures who I named. They're all resolutely unfashionable in certain ways. And it strikes me that there's something there, that if we want to be attuned to sacredness, we need to have a certain kind of resistance to fads, because fads are almost never going to be a sure guide to sacredness, right? They could certainly, I could imagine an influencer on TikTok having a whole series of short videos about their encounters with sacredness, and there'd probably be something really good about it. But as soon as it becomes a thing, it transmutes into something else. And so it does strike me that there needs to be, a kind of resistance to fashions and fads. They all march to their own drummer. And that's what I had in mind with that. And again, I'll try to say more about that. My sense is that there's a kind of freedom that doesn't have to do with sort of I can do whatever I want, but rather a freedom from being carried along by certain forces that frees people to do something like slow down and attend to this thing right in front of me or this person who comes across my path, right? Thank you.
Hey there, I'm John Dewick. I really enjoyed this. It was just fantastic. And I'm an ethnomusicologist.
Oh, good. Cool.
And so some of the things that you described make me think of the ways people talk about how ideology and practices inform sort of perception in the senses, so sort of anthropology of the senses, this kind of thing that also appears in the anthropology of religion.
Oh, cool. Good.
And one paper that I remember that's really reminded me of was my friend and teacher David Grammett, who wrote this paper about a sort of Adorno, a critical theorist, and what Adorno was listening to as a kid. Like what were the sound world, these string quartets around him, and then thinking about his own background as a sort of working class kid in an Anglo context, listening to brass bands and things.
Yeah.
Anyway, so that the sense of the aesthetic was situated in a material context.
Yes.
Right? And I'm wondering, the folks that you mentioned, so everything you've said makes a ton of sense to me, and I also want more of what Simone Weil and Thomas Merton and Annie Dillard have. But I'm wondering if you could talk about the ways in which, or if you're going to talk about the ways in which these are situated in some material context. Like these seem like very middle class, highly educated senses of the sacred. Does that make sense? That's not meant as that's throwing you under the bus. I'm identifying with it, but trying to ask about how you're situating these folks.
Yeah, no, it's a great question, and I'm perfectly liable to it, and I'm happy to get it. I only gestured in this direction, but a big part of what I have in mind here is that the figures I mentioned are representative figures. And they do capture something, but what they capture is something that I also see in lots of regular folks, right? People who might, like all of the people I mentioned, they write incredibly well. But writing incredibly well is not a qualification for being somebody attuned to sacredness. And so it's something I'm grateful for, but I'm also very much trying to be true to some of the just ordinary folks I know who exhibit this same kind of thing in all walks of life, right? But will I attend your very good question, will I attend to the material kind of background, the material conditions that lead to this? That's a good question. I won't in the course of these lectures, but there's a lot that I've cut from these lectures that maybe I should make sure I bring back in.
Thank you very much.
Yeah, but if you have further thoughts, let's talk afterward. I'd love that. Thank you. Hello.
Hello, my name's Larry. I'm a student here at CMU. So when you were laying out different ways we can understand sacred things, you mentioned things that are like pleasurable or lovely as a category.
Yeah.
Like a catchy tune, for instance.
Yeah.
And then you also notice things that are sacred because of something like deeper within them that's sort of transcendent. So I was thinking of like an example, like someone has a catchy tune that they really love in their life, and then they die, and then that song is played at their funeral, right? And then that same catchy tune might seem to be transcendent. So I was wondering if you could help me understand maybe a relevant difference between the categories of like these types of sacredness.
Yeah, great question. So that's a case where I think there's an overlap between the category of what I was calling sacred beauty and preciousness, right? So you're like, I might just love really kitschy art, and if someone asks me why I love it, I'll just say, it's just pretty. I just love the way it looks, and that's it, right? It's just two-dimensional for me. And so it might not, even for me, have any of that transcendent kind of beauty, and yet, when I pass away, my kids, who might make fun of me for it, might also feel like those things are among the most precious things on earth. I wouldn't trade them for anything. I wouldn't trade them for a much better piece of art or anything like that, right? So there's a way in which like I said, these things can kind of move across categories. Something could be part of many of these categories. I tried to give clear examples, but I'm not always great at that. And it's also the case that one person's two-dimensional art can be very three-dimensional to someone else, right? So I might just hear a catchy tune and think like, oh yeah, that's just pop or something like that. But somebody else, a bit like some of the most interesting sort of music criticism tries to look at pop music and think, no, there actually is a way in which there is something more complicated going on here. It's not even just complications, right? That there is some way in which this is gesturing at or pulling us toward bigger themes or something more kind of going on, putting us in touch with something, right? And so it's very much not just a matter of what's in the eye of the beholder. And there's also the case that, I'm not sure I want to put it exactly like this. It doesn't have to, it's not as if it has to be catchy, but if there isn't something pleasing in it that makes us want to linger on it, then it's not going to have the kind of beauty that I'm talking about, right? So it's actually hard to draw bright line distinctions between the two. And so yeah, it's a good question. I appreciate that. Thank you. I think we may have time for one more question. Yeah.
Hi, I'm Patrick. I'm a student here.
Hi.
And I found myself meditating on you discussing the value aspect of sacredness. And you glossed over the hypothetical of when you try and say like, oh, would you like how much money would it take, say, to violate some sacredness, to throw away an heirloom or something, or violate a human life. And that got me thinking about taking that out of the hypothetical. And I guess I can't really fabricate this question very clearly. I imagine if I wouldn't have the question at all. But
I doubt that.
How does one cope with real-world situations in which the sacredness contradicts each other, or you come into a situation where things of unmeasurable value are pitted up against each other, and you have to deal with that conundrum, I suppose.
Yeah, I mean, so I only mentioned it here or there, but part of what this framework helps me think about is that sometimes different forms of sacredness butt up against each other in ways that produce some of the tragedies of life, right? This is one of the reasons I talked very briefly about the kind of pull between things that are precious to us and the dignity of all involved, right? Where people end up making choices whether do I prioritize those near and dear to me, or do I think I have some obligation to equally prioritize the immeasurable worth of all involved, right? These things can pull in different directions. But it's also the case that there are other ways that things that are sacred can come into conflict. And when that happens, we experience it as tragic, and we experience it as tragic because they are sacred to us, right? So I think it's glib to say it counts in favor of the theory, but I do think this kind of language helps me think about that. I also think that's part of why there's all kinds of research about why negotiations where you try to get people to compromise get harder, not easier, when you try to get people to compromise on things that are sacred to them, right? There's a kind of tragic dimension to that too. They're not just tragedies, though. Sometimes those sorts of violations are due to injustice. And this helps me think about that, too. There's all kinds of injustices, but some of those injustices desecrate things that ought to be treated as inviolable, and those are a particularly horrible kind of injustice. And I think that's a pretty basic moral category that I want to hold on to. Yeah, thank you. All right, do you want to give us a closing word then?
Thank you, Kevin, for this delightfully generative and rich opening. Thank you to all of you for coming out. I hope to see you back here this evening at 7 p.m. To dive deeper into this notion of sacred power.
Yeah, great. Thank you.
Thanks for coming out.